Hello everyone, Alec Elger, the SideQuest Gamer here, and welcome to the finale of my classic Mega Man NES retrospective. And we're going to wrap things up with Mega Man 6. Now this game is the very last in the
Guess who? I heard you were
reviewing Mega Man 6, and because it's your favorite in the classic NES series, you wanted to join in somehow. Welcome to the show, MD. I knew this was your favorite in the classic series, and because of that, you'd show up unexpectedly. I mean, it's not like I wrote the script or anything.
Oh, well, should we?
Sit down, shut up, and let's take a look at Mega Man 6 to see if it holds up after 20 long years. The classic Mega Man series continues to surprise me. Not only has it reached a whopping 6 entries, but they're still making them for the NES. But 1994 was when everything changed in North America, because in January, we saw the first Mega Man game released on the 16-bit Super Nintendo console, Mega Man X, and it was awesome! From having brand new controls like the wall jump and the dash, to exciting new bosses that accompany these abilities, a fantastic MIDI soundtrack, a more dramatic story, a 16-bit art style. It doesn't matter what era you were born in, because when I played Mega Man X after playing the first 6 games a few years ago, I was quite impressed with it. I didn't know whether I liked it more or less than the classics back then, but I did know this was the next step the Mega Man series needed, and with Mega Man X being on a console a lot of people were buying games for at the time, it sold quite well worldwide, being over 1 million units. But a few months later, in the spring of 1994, Mega Man 6 was released on the NES, and because Mega Man X was blowing everyone away on the brand new console, it seems like 6 was only meant for people who still had the NES or wanted to buy the new top-loader NES just to play the new classic series entry. And that kind of factors into the sales being only over 500,000 units worldwide, with only 280,000 units sold in North America. However, with re-releases for 6th-gen systems, it gained a more successful life after death, and for many new Mega Man fans, 6 is either their favorite or one of their favorites in the classic series. But to understand why Mega Man 6 even exists in the format it is, it's best that we look at the development history. It was of course developed by the talented people over at Capcom. They worked on this game roughly around the same time as Mega Man X. Inafune mentioned that for this game, due to how it's not often a series makes it to 6 entries, they were going to make a game knowing that the player would come to expect many things. But they also wanted to try out new ideas, and so they implemented the Rush adapter abilities, where Rush would combine with Mega Man. Even though Inafune thought it was unrealistic, this is classic Mega Man. Realism isn't exactly what the series is known for. In fact, I dare argue that the lack of any realism is what gives the series so much charm. Like the last several entries, the Robot Masters were the result of design submissions by fans, but Mega Man 6 was the first in the series to open up the contest over to the folks in North America. However, only 2 North American art submissions were used, while the other 6 were Japanese art submissions. But what's really neat is how the North American box art of Mega Man 6 features the 2 Robot Masters designed by the North Americans. And upon release, Capcom this time didn't publish this game outside of Japan, but instead Nintendo of America did it themselves, and boy did they have plans for it. You see, in 1994, Nintendo released a somewhat famous NES top-loader console for, get this, only $50. To put this into perspective, $50 back then was worth $82 today, which is a steal for a console even this late. And where Mega Man 6 fits into all this was to entice buyers to purchase the NES top loader, and you can't do that without a few new games to sell, furthering the incentive to do so. Among these were Mega Man 6, as well as Star Tropics 2, Zoda's Revenge, and Wario's Woods, both being pretty good games in their own right. So this game has quite the interesting development history. Not only was it the last classic Mega Man game on the NES, it was also one of the last NES games, period. So in addition to functioning as a standalone game, does this also function well as a conclusionary game to the NES era?
As if you have to ask. Of course it is!
Shut up, Mega Poop. I'm just trying to build up suspense for the audience.
You're a reviewer, not a cable show director.
I do what I want. This is my show. I'm the SideQuest Gamer, and I say what goes on in the SideQuest Gamer review show. As long as the audience is perfectly fine with it, of course.
The game begins with an intro like the past two games, and this time a robot tournament is being held, with 8 of the most powerful robots from around the world being the contestants. What exactly they do in this game isn't specified in-game, but the sponsor of this competition, Mr. X, uses the robots to take over the world. And with Dr. Wily escaping in the last time, he's probably behind this. But the game designers were smart enough to say that, no, Dr. Wily was actually manipulated by Mr. X. As to how he was manipulated isn't exactly specified, but one can hypothesize that Dr. Wily was used to help him take control of the robots before betraying the scientists, because, you know, Dr. Wily has reprogrammed robots in the past. And Mega Man vows to stop this new villain. It's really as simple as that. The manual does elaborate further on the robots who entered into the tournament. 6 of the designers were from Japan, 1 was from America, and 1 was from Canada, just like the art submission winners. It's kind of cool because it's a situation where art imitates real life, as if the contest winners are supposed to be the robot designers who entered their robots into the tournament, or they could battle in a series of tests to see who was the most powerful robot in the world. It's such a clever way to pay tribute to these artists. Regardless, 8 robot masters with their own unique powers, with one robot weak to another robot's weapon. Part of the challenge is figuring out the order it goes in. That's all fine and good, it's standard Mega Man game design. But beyond what we come to expect are the new additions that the series has not seen in this manner before. I mean, yes, we once again have a new charge Mega Buster called the Hyper Mega Buster, and it functions as well as it did last time. The Charge Buster is a bit different. The highest shot is about as big as the one from Mega Man 4, but it also has the Mega Man 5 charge limitation where if you get hit by an enemy projectile, you would lose that held charge, making this probably the best balanced Charge Buster I've seen so far. But this game's biggest addition to the series isn't something you'd get from the start, but rather by playing through a few levels and eventually earning these abilities. Gone is the Rush Coil and Jet abilities we had in the last 3 games, but the replacements are the Rush adapters. And basically, it has the robot dog Rush somehow combine himself with Mega Man to give him new abilities, like Power Mega Man and Jet Mega Man. By the way, I just love these animations. Power Mega Man gives you the ability to punch things and make short work of enemies, and even breaking these giant blocks present in some stages to get access to goodies you wouldn't otherwise have access to. And Jet Mega Man is even better, since you can fly in an upwards arc for a few seconds to get to higher places, and even explore sections of the level since there are instances of dividing pathways. However, you can only get Power Mega Man by beating Flame Man, and Jet Mega Man by beating Plant Man. Because of this, repeat playthroughs would involve figuring out how soon you want these abilities, and especially how soon you'll need them, since they're both required to get the side quest content in this game, but that's only if you're the completionist type, and the side quest content isn't necessarily mandatory, which is always a plus.
But of course it isn't a Mega Man game without 8 new Robot Master stages.
Before starting a level, we're usually treated to a robot master doing a cool pose with their name displayed, just so the player knows what's waiting to kill them at the end of the stage. But Mega Man 6 takes this a step further, whereas we enter the stage, we get their stats and a description of what they're about in addition to their name. Like how Windman is a master of wind, and how some of these robots rely on different energy types, like Flame Man being solar powered and Windman being wind powered. It just gives more life to these robot masters. It shows more thought was put into them and expands how we see them. I mean, it may not tie into the gameplay at all, but it's nonetheless a neat emphasis on how robots function in this futuristic world, whereas a lot of these robots just run on clean energy sources as opposed to fossil fuels common in 1994. And I must say, even though we never had a Waveman or Gravity Man stage in terms of a high quality gimmick, these stages are probably the best in terms of overall consistency. There are no okay stages, there are no decent stages. All of these stages don't sell for anything less than good, with a few even being spectacular. The first stage I usually start out on is Windman, and of course Wind will be the name of the game here. There's these giant fans that can lift you up to a higher place, especially for a wind-propelled high jump, and it gets progressively harder and harder as they introduce new obstacles alongside these fan obstacles. From the floating turrets to even the instant kill spikes, which is level design 101 for utilizing a gimmick. But this stage is no one-trick pony because throughout it are these enemies that can move left and right and will rocket themselves in that direction if you're in proximity, requiring good timing from the player, and these platforms that switch sides when stepped on also require good timing. These last few obstacles I just mentioned are prevalent throughout this game, but as for the case with the enemies, you'll eventually gain power-ups to make them one less thing to worry about, which is a satisfying enough reward for a persistent obstacle if you ask me. And as a result, One Man Stage is quite entertaining, and if it's your first stage like it is mine, it's quite the good first impression of what the rest of the game is going to be like. Next is Flame Man Stage, and it's quite an interesting one. It starts off with nothing but you and this purple liquid that doesn't do anything to you, but later on, these flying enemies that shoot fire downwards are introduced. Alright, but little did I know this was build up. Now I'm introduced to a pool of purple liquid and holy, it's on fire! Yeah, this purple liquid is probably oil or some liquid that is flammable, and these pools of fire will kill you in one hit. So now the rest of the stage is just progressively more challenging fire pool obstacles, but what I like about these is that if you can kill the flying enemy before it drops the fire into the liquid, it will remain safe for you to walk around in, rewarding skilled players with an easier time in the level. But again, because it gets harder, the last section of the level ditches the flying enemies entirely in favor of higher HP torch head enemies that have a higher chance of igniting the pool, and as a result, it's such a unique take on the fire-based level. I mean, sure, Fireman and Heatman's levels just have pools of lava with the game visually reminding you, don't go in there, you might get killed, but this level gives you the choice of whether these insta-kill pools of fire even happen in the first place, which I find to be a especially clever design choice. And it just goes to show you can rework a tired stage motif into something brand new in itself. Moving on to Blizzard Man Stage, it's not my favorite level in the game, especially as a follow-up to Flame Man Stage, but it's still quite good, especially when it comes to snow-themed levels, and as you would expect, there are the ice physics that come with this level motif. Despite that, it's quite different in other areas because of these time bomb platforms that once stepped on would detonate in a few seconds, as indicated by the number at the center of it, but the placement of these platforms pretty much require them to be stepped on just so they're not in your way, like for the boss door. And there's a really cool segment of the level involving a submarine that submerges and resurfaces every few seconds, making you time your progression carefully since some parts of the submarine will hit instant kill spikes when surfacing again. And with all the secret areas like breakable ice cubes you need the power adapter for, ice walls that can be melted with Heatman's weapon, and the presence of these squid mini-bosses, there's just so much enjoyable content in the level. Despite being one of my lesser favorite stages in the game, it has enough stage variety to keep me interested and doesn't overstay its welcome. And then we move on to Plant Man Stage, which is one I used to not look forward to, but honestly, it's a lot better than I remember. I mean, the mini-boss that just corners you can be a real pain in the butt if you don't kill it quickly, but the rest of the stage is quite good. There are a ton of these springs that will allow you to make some pretty high jumps over these murky pits of water, but what made me initially hate this stage with a burning passion were these fish that popped out of the water because I didn't have the shield power I would usually use for obstacles like these, and me being the impatient one a long time ago would just want to bum rush through it and get knockback damage into a bottomless water pit, which would result in going back to the checkpoint. And every time I would respawn, I would be so infuriated. But honestly, even they weren't as bad as I remember because they only pop out of the water and nothing else pops out. So when it's about to go back into the water, that's when you jump onto the next platform. It's really that simple, especially for the section where you can just shoot open the platforms. Don't get me wrong, it's probably my least favorite Robot Master stage due to the slower pace, but in this case, it's just a good stage that isn't as fun as the other 7. It doesn't blow my mind except for the background having a treacherous jungle look to it. But Plant Man Stage is pretty fun regardless. And what comes next is probably one of the better levels in the game, Tomahawk Man Stage. This, of course, has a Wild West themed level, which amusingly has cowboy robots with pistols, and that's really what the obstacles amount to. It's combat oriented with some instances of platforming, but what makes the stage awesome is the split paths where the higher path has platforms over instant kill spikes, but eventually leads to an E-tank and other good stuff, while the other has these skull enemies with nothing in return for taking that path except that the path is shorter than the higher one, which is honestly how you balance out the player choice since each one has their own benefits to the player. So as combat heavy Mega Man stages go, this one I like even more than Skullman stage thanks to the enemy variety with the Metal gumball machines and the plethora of skull-shaped enemies. And there are enough environmental hazards like the bottomless pits and the occasional spikes that keep things tense and progress the difficulty curve of these combat situations rather than stagnate it. And Yamato Man stage follows a similar idea with combat, from the high HP spearmen enemies to the dragonfly bombers. This stage can be a bit hectic at times, but nonetheless fun, especially since the seamless flow is assisted by the non-linear pathway in the beginning, where once again you can choose an easier but longer path or a shorter path that has a unique mini-boss, showing that this level has a good variety. And if you think the stages couldn't get any better than that, they do with the next two. Nightman stage starts out the way you'd expect the usual Mega Man stage to start out, but then you see this giant spike trap from the ceiling slowly descending and rising up, and your only protection are these gaps, but there are enemies in the way, giving you more things to worry about. There's just so much tension in this one screen that the challenge feels rewarding when you get past it. And the rest of the stage has these returning spinning platforms for Mega Man 5 Wily Castle with a similar instant kill consequence, nothing we haven't seen before, and that's all there really is for most of the stage. Spikes. Spikes everywhere. But the best part is the bouncy section with the left and right moving platforms on them. This is so much fun since it changes up the pace with these enemies not being on the flat surface but rather a bouncy one. But it also increases the challenge since it can be really easy to get touch damage if you don't bounce carefully. Sometimes you want to bounce on top of these platforms, and other times you want to bounce underneath it so you don't hit the enemy above. And that's why Nightman stage is one of my favorites in the series. But the best stage in the game is definitely Centaur Man stage. At first glance it seems like your everyday underwater Mega Man stage, except now with fish and turret obstacles. Alright, that's pretty standard. And it isn't an underwater stage without instant kill spikes punishing those who make too high of a jump or miscalculate it. This stage is so far just as good as Bulbman or Dive Man stage, so what's so special about this one in particular? Well, I'm glad you asked. This stage becomes so much better than those two when you go into that opening after the spikes and all of a sudden you're on ground and there's water above you. How is this possible? So you being on flat ground with water on the upper half of the screen, you then use the water's jump physics to your advantage to get past the hopping enemies as well as the giant pits of spikes everywhere. This is so much fun! And while the rest of the stage afterwards is all good with your standard platforming obstacles that only threaten avoidable knockback damage, but that upside down water section is probably the highlight of the game for merging an abstract idea with good platforming. So these Robot Master stages overall, while not as experimental as Mega Man 5 was with its level design, I do believe that for the content and quality consistency they offer, there's never a dull moment in Mega Man 6 and are by far the best levels in the series. Especially when it comes to finding the secret exits in the game to assemble Beat the Bird.
My side quest sense is really tingling this time. This looks like a job for...
Side quest sense? Oh, me. The writing for this show is awful. Since when the did you have side quest sense?
Since I took a radioactive arrow to the knee?
I'm sorry, bro. That's terrible. I'm done with this.
To find the 4 beat letters, you have to go through a secret pathway and exit the stage through them. These secret exits are blocked off by blocks or areas inaccessible if, say, you didn't have the power or jet adapters, and they add their own usually more challenging variation of obstacles seen in their respective stages, rather than just be letters you can collect in the already existing stage. And if you beat a stage normally, you would have to fight the same boss again regardless, but because of how much fun it was getting to them and fighting them normally, I don't mind this at all on repeat playthroughs, and you can just go straight for the secret exits instead of fighting the bosses normally. And Beat the Bird is even better than last time, since now he can't attack bosses. He can now only attack normal enemies, which is completely fine since now it wouldn't ruin a boss battle like it did last time, so the Beat the Bird side quest in this game is worth it. But there's another side quest I didn't even know existed for the longest time, and the item is so useful, it was the deciding factor in why Mega Man 6 became my favorite Mega Man game in the classic series. In Tomahawk Man stage, there's a block only destructible by the power adapter, and in there, Proto Man appears and gives you the energy bouncer before leaving. He doesn't say hi or nothing, and he probably didn't have time to. But this energy bouncer alleviates one of the minor inconveniences you didn't notice until it was no longer an inconvenience. Did you ever use another weapon because you're so low on that weapon's energy you need to refill it? It's so annoying that you have to have that weapon equipped to refill it, whereas if you collected an energy refill with your default weapon equipped, it would just be wasted. But thanks to the energy balancer, collecting a weapon refill when the weapon adapter or default weapons are equipped would just distribute the energy to a random weapon. That saves so much time, whereas I don't have to stop what I'm doing, pause the game, equip the low energy weapon, get weapon refill, pause again, re-equip the default weapon, and then go about my business. See what I mean by how it saves time? This item alone made this game the most ideal classic Mega Man experience in the classic series for me to play over and over. And sure, Mega Man X1 did that months before, but that doesn't matter. The classic series has it now.
And it's all thanks to me.
Sure, leave it to you to take credit for my full enjoyment with the game. I mean, sure, I did like Mega Man 5 back then, until I saw your Mega Man 6 Let's Play where you got the energy balancer that I had no idea existed.
Finally, he sees the light.
Hey, people can change.
Before then, I just thought that block was too high risk for me to care about what was probably an E-tank that I already had a bunch of already, but little did I know that it was housing something that would change how I felt about Mega Man 6 as an overall experience. So this side quest is also worth it. If this game is constantly surprising you with things in further playthroughs, then that is a testament to how accessible, how convenient, and how well designed this game is.
Dude, Mega Man 6 is literally everything that Mega Man 4 and 5 should have been.
Hey, I like Mega Man's 4 and 5.
Hey, I never said they were bad games, you know, they're fine games, you know? But Mega Man 6, literally everything about it is perfect. It's a perfect game. Well, except the bosses, you know, they're pathetically easy, but you know, the game is almost perfect. You know, solid 9.9 out of 10.
Yeah, they're not exactly the most challenging, unless you're fighting them with your Charge Buster and nothing else.
The boss battles at the end of each stage are either really challenging with a default weapon, or really easy with their weakness, which feels unbalanced for both sides. Bosses like Windman and Plantman provide a legitimate challenge as a first boss since their attack patterns are dodgeable, but provide a fair challenge for the player, while bosses like Flame Man and Centaur Man are very challenging to fight with the default weapon since Flame Man's flame attacks are unpredictable, and Centaur Man is so tall you can't even jump over him when he approaches you, and his attacks can freeze you in place. I know it's possible to beat him with the default weapon, but it doesn't feel entirely fair if someone who doesn't have outside knowledge goes into this boss battle blind. And I imagine these would be hell for speedrunners trying to do a no-hit run. Honestly, it shouldn't be mandatory to have to use E-tanks in any boss fight because that would just show how thoughtlessly the boss was designed, and once you do have their weaknesses, they can go down rather easily rather than put up a good fight. I feel that the perfect compromise would be Yamato Man and Tomahawk Man's battles because while they're harder with the default weapons, the player can still defeat them once they recognize their attack patterns. But even if the weapon they're vulnerable to is equipped, they still put up a fight that while easy is still a great time. That's how the rest of these bosses should have been.
But you gotta admit, the weapons are f***ing awesome.
Yeah, I really like them.
The weapons are by far the best the series has seen so far, not because I find myself using all of them, but also because of how there's not one weapon that I would flat out consider useless or overpowered, which is a series first. The Silver Tomahawk is one of my personal favorites because it can do a good amount of damage and tends to move in an upward arc, useful for certain boss battles and even higher HP enemies that are on higher ground than you. The Yamato Spear is quite fun for shooting enemies straight ahead rapidly, making short work of higher HP enemies and especially landborne mini-bosses. The Center Flash is good as a screen nuke that can destroy all lower HP enemies on screen, but like most flash type weapons, it's quite the energy hog so players can't use it all the time, and that's perfectly fine by me since I only feel the need to use it for weaker airborne enemies for careful platforming situations. The Flame Blast is good for landborne enemies since it only moves in a downward arc, deploying a temporary flame wall on the floor, but it does deal quite a bit of damage in addition to being able to melt ice walls and having access to secret areas. And the Night Crush is pretty good as well, serving as this game's version of the Shadow Blade since it can be shot multi-directionally and has a boomerang effect in that it comes back towards you. This can come in handy for higher HP enemies and mini-bosses that are quite a distance away. And with these weapons being so useful, there are of course weapons that are fun to use, but I don't use them as often as others. But make no mistake, the following are still quite useful in their own rights. The Windstorm is pretty useful since 2 shots of it on some lower HP enemies would result in the enemy being carried off screen by the tornadoes. This was pretty fun to use, but they don't leave any HP or items after this happens. The Plant Barrier is a step backwards from what Starman's Shield base power introduced. I mean, it's basically Skullman's Shield from Mega Man 4, and as it is, it's useful for taking a hit for me without losing health, and any enemy that touches it seems to take quite a bit of damage, which is why it's still good. And the Blizzard attack was something I didn't use often, except for the bosses it was weak to, but I recently discovered it could take out the left and right moving enemies, whatever they're called. Sure, the Power Rush adapter can do it with a charged fist, but because the ice projectiles have 2 moving straight forward and 2 moving diagonally, sometimes you can take out more than 1 at a time. And with that being said, the weapons all succeed in not only balance but also efficiency. There's a purpose to each and every one of them beyond the bosses that are weak to them, and if that's the case, that is when you know you have a fantastic Mega Man experience.
But it's not over yet because we still have to fight Mr. X in his treacherous fortress.
Dude, we all know that Mr. X is really...
Shut up, they don't know yet.
Oh yeah, that's right. Suspense.
And as usual, we enter Mr. X's fortress. This is by far my favorite fortress in the classic series because of how varied and enjoyable the obstacles in each stage are. X Stage 1 is a good starting level not only from a gameplay standard, but also in terms of world building because of how it starts out next to a building, and the whole stage is about you breaking into that very building. The first section involves taking out turrets while avoiding spikes and climbing up the tower, but at this point you have both rush adapters and the first section requires you to use them to reach the ladders, while the second section being on top of the tower just has these skull enemies and gives you the option of either destroying the blocks to get past these columns or just use the rush jet over it. But this is just one long path you can take. There's actually a second shorter pathway that's harder to get to, where there's these 2 flipping platforms and a breakable window next to the top one, but up above that very platform are instant kill spikes, so jumping to the other side when the platform flips is out of the question. From my experience, you essentially have to jump on the left side of the top flipping platform with the power adapter's punch fully charged and smashing the window on the edge of that platform before falling and climbing back up to a now accessible building. And because the challenge to get there was much higher, this pathway rewards you with energy refills for your weapons and a ton of extra lives. Did I also mention this path is a much shorter way to the boss room? It's the most rewarding shortcut in the game, bar none. X Stage 2 is more linear and kind of a downgrade from the previous stage, but it does have its own identity. You mainly fight a lot of the weaker enemies as you head right, but there are these pits they can fall into, identifiable by the holes in the foreground, and they usually have things like energy refills, but after that there are these floor spikes and ceiling spikes introduced in addition to a barrage of enemies, and eventually the game combines the 2 obstacles together, but because it gave context to these pits previously, they should be easy to identify, and because of the context, that's why these obstacles are so unique. The only missed opportunity in the stage was the collapsing bridge. Now I do like these for the suspense, but I can't help but feel that some flying enemies should have been included this late in the game. Heck, Mega Man 5 did that, and that was in a Robot Master stage. I mean, since we have the slide ability and Plant Man's ability this late in the game, it really could have been put to good use, but other than that, the stage itself was quite fun. Just not my favorite in the entire fortress. X Stage 3 starts out with 2 ladders with one leading to a dead end, but with an E-tank for good measure, while the other actually allows you to progress through the level. Going the wrong way, I admit, can be a bad first impression, but the rest of this level offers these seesaw platforms in addition to these flying enemies and ceiling spikes that already posed a threat, which can be good fun, although it does involve waiting for the platform you're sitting on to lower, which can take a few seconds, breaking the pace a bit. But that's just for the first set, as the next 2 ditch the ceiling spikes in favor of new challenges like areas that require the use of the jet adapter, with airborne enemies threatening knockback damage into the abyss. This is more up my alley since it keeps the flow of a Mega Man game, especially for seasoned veterans of the series, and it also gives you something different than simply walking on a floor and shooting enemies. So X Stage 3 is great. And X Stage 4 has a bit of everything from the Robot Master stages. It's mainly a combat-focused stage with some of the standard platforming you've come to expect, although I do find it odd that the easier one rewards you with an extra life for facing lower HP enemies and no bottomless pits, as opposed to the Cowboy path that has a few bottomless pits and higher HP enemies. So I don't think they implemented that non-linear path as well as the previous stages. And with that being said, the X stages are all really enjoyable, from introducing new obstacles that the Robot Master stages haven't delved into, to evolving already existing obstacles like shortcuts and certain enemies. But the stages are only a part of why I love the X Fortress so much, because the bosses at the end of them are just as good as the stages beforehand, well, at least 3 out of 4 of them. X Stage 1's boss is a bit challenging because of how they move on rails quickly, and you have to hit them from the sides as that's their weak spot, which is easier said than done given their speed. But because you can jump over them and are given enough time to react to them despite it being a small window of time, it's by no means frustrating at all. It's definitely one of the harder bosses in the game, but this stems from challenge rather than cheap frustration, showing we've come a long way since Mega Man 1 and its first Fortress stage boss. X Stage 2's boss is more challenging and even better than the last one since it climbs up and down a wall, having giant boulders crash down in addition to shooting pellets. The rocks do fall pretty fast, but with the slide ability they are avoidable, and the challenge comes from doing that and trying to aim either the Silver Tomahawk or the Charge Buster at the boss. And while it's definitely not the best boss in the game, it was good enough to be the last obstacle in the level regardless of whether you had enough energy for its weakness or default weapon. X Stage 3's boss is a bit on the easy side, but it's quite engaging for what it's worth since it's a Metal riding a giant mech, but it's so unique because it's chasing you while throwing different types of projectiles at you, whether it be energy spheres shot in a straight way, whereas they can be dodged with a slide, or the bouncing one, where you have to time them in a way where you can go underneath them to dodge their touch damage. And with its cockpit being the weakness, there's plenty of things to pay attention to, making this boss quite satisfying to fight, and dare I say the best boss in the Fortress? It may regress the difficulty curve set by the first two, but it does have the spectacle of a stage boss, and there's enough challenge variety in its attack patterns to still be a fun boss battle regardless. And last but not least, we finally have the epic battle to the death that is Mr. X. And it sucks. For one, Mr. X deploys energy bursts that divide and move along the floor, while his vehicle moves left and right, but not necessarily in a fair attack pattern because I found myself either taking touch damage from the vehicle or the energy burst. Maybe if I'm lucky, I would jump at the open space over the energy burst, but even then, he's really easy. Just spam the flame attack on him and he'll go down within seconds. But in Mega Man fashion, he escapes his destroyed vehicle in a floating chair and mentions how his scheme for world domination has failed. And that's Mega Man 6, the end.
Come on, Alec. You used that joke already like a load of times. It gets old after like several reviews.
Well, maybe the Mega Man games should stop doing dumb fake outs. It gets old after several games.
Touché.
But because this plot is so simple, it comes as no surprise that Mr. X was Dr. Wily.
I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you meddling kids.
Again, you used that joke before. I mean, even Scooby-Doo fans have their limits.
I mean, yeah, the game tries to tell you that in the beginning that Mr. X used Dr. Wily before betraying him, but come on, it may fool someone who played Mega Man 6 as their first Mega Man game without any outside knowledge of the series, but longtime fans aren't so intellectually deficient that they can't put 2 and 2 together. A balding man with gray hair and a mustache who uses robots to take over the world and has a lot of money, versus a balding scientist with gray hair and a mustache who also uses robots to take over the world and probably has a lot of money to afford to pay for new fortresses and a robot army that constantly keep getting destroyed in previous games. Yeah, I see no similarities whatsoever. It literally is Dr. Wily with sunglasses and a black robe, and I suppose it can be taken either way as to whether Capcom was doing this to try and play with that player's expectations, or were they so self-aware that they wrote the text as it is, but intentionally designed Mr. X to look exactly like Wily, hence why his disguise was revealing. Regardless, despite his plans for taking over the world being ruined, he still has enough power to destroy Mega Man.
Oh boy, here it comes!
Huh, that was quick.
Wow, No 20-second scene of Dr. Wily winking at us from the UFO with that ear-grating noise playing for that long. This is really the best classic Mega Man game. And the text says it best before going into Dr. Wily's fortress. Let the final battle begin! Wily Stage 1 is pretty exciting. It's one of those free-falling areas where you have to move yourself to avoid incoming spikes, but at the third screen is where the paths split, because if you activate your jet early on, you can fly over to the breakable block and gain access to a set of ladders, with one of them leading to an E-tank. It's quite fun, but unlike the last castle in Mega Man 5, there aren't any that would just pop out of nowhere and kill you before you could react. And Wily Stage 1 sets up a good first impression of this fortress. Wily Stage 2 reintroduces a lot of enemies from Blizzard Man Stage, and even adds in ice physics, but then we have the return of the disappearing block puzzle that this time has two ways to go about it. You can either use them to get up to the slidable area, or you can use a different set of blocks to melt that ice wall with a flame. For a puzzle idea that's been used a lot, it still manages to surprise me as a veteran player, even if it doesn't blow my mind like it did in the third entry. And the rest of the stage is standard platforming with enemies fought in previous stages. That's about it, really. But Wily Stage 2, for what it's worth, I think is a little better than the first one. Same can be said for what follows. Wily Stage 3 begins with a pretty cool underwater section that can be really tricky for newcomers. The fan enemies that switch from pulling you in and out every few seconds return in this stage, and it doesn't help that there are spikes everywhere. The last fan enemy especially, since if you make one wrong button press of a directional button, you might send yourself flying into the spikes as punishment for not paying attention to the enemy's visual cue, being the arrow pointing where it's blowing air to. And the rest of the stage is a boss rush of previously fought robot masters. I said my piece on them before, and they're exactly the same here. And like the X Fortress, the Wily Fortress has the end bosses you come to expect. X Stage 1 has the Stegosaurus boss, and it's so much fun hopping on these upwards moving platforms and attacking its vulnerable head while it tries to spit fire at you. It actually has some strategy when it comes to taking him out. That is a combination of good timing and using the environment to your advantage. Definitely another one of my favorite bosses in the game, even if it's a bit on the easy side. Although I will say it's too bad Wily Stage 2's boss is easy to disappointing degrees. It just approaches you, spams its attack, but its weakness being the wind tornado can carry away some of its projectiles. It just goes down in a few seconds without any remotely interesting attack pattern. And it doesn't help that it just leaves itself out in the open ready for your attack, basically being cannon fodder of the boss battle, and as a result is by far the worst boss in the game, which results in being a mixed bag of fortress bosses. One is great, while the other just drops the boss difficulty curve a lot, which I suppose isn't much since there's 16 other bosses that are much better than this one. And hey, I can do a lot worse. And moving on to the last stage of the game, since the teleporter doesn't have a Dr. Wily Phase 1 boss battle in X Stage 3. No, this time it leads right to the final level being primarily a boss stage, and this stage is light on enemies. There's a weapon tank to refill one of your weapons, and if you're low on weapon energy, there is a met tool dispenser that cleverly allows players to grind for weapon energy from defeated met tools, but because they rarely drop big energy refills, I find it less time consuming to just get a game over suicide resets. And then the returning Eddie, the item lottery robot, who appeared in several levels before and functioned as he did in Mega Man 4 and 5, gives you one last item before the final boss battle begins. I just love Eddie's placement here, especially because of how it just builds up to this encounter, as if this really is the final climactic battle between Mega Man and his longtime arch nemesis Dr. Wily. So Eddie does what he can to help out Mega Man because it's the least he can do. With that being said, thanks Eddie. And we finally faced Dr. Wily in a 3-phase boss battle. Even though it's easy, this probably is my favorite Dr. Wily encounter, from his Skullcraft needing 3 phases in a battle to the death, to the epic music playing in the background as the screen is scrolling right. The first phase has Wily's craft trying to crush you and deal a good amount of touch damage, and then fire 3 large projectiles before initiating another crushing attack, and it repeats until phase 1 Wily is defeated. Then his cockpit opens up revealing Wily, and he does a similar attack, except that the jumps are more specific this time around, where he fires straight projectiles, and it's kind of easier than phase 1 if you ask me. And once phase 2 is defeated, phase 3 gives us more of what we want. It's kind of similar to the Wily capsule in Mega Man 5 on how he fires clockwise moving spheres that expand their range, and the upwards arc of the silver tomahawks really come in handy for this phase especially. And after that easy but fun climactic boss battle, Dr. Wily begs for mercy once again. No escape attempts, no running away like a coward, no fake deaths, and for Mega Man, no stupidity, because this time he brought a rope. Yeah, remember when Mega Man in between castle stages brought that rope from the dimension of plot conveniences? No? Well, who cares? He has a rope, he ties Dr. Wily up, and the next scene shows Dr. Wily screaming his head off before bars slam in front of him. It's about freaking time this scientist was locked up. I really like how this last scene is a newspaper being the 20XX version of the Capcom Times. That's cute. Especially with it saying how he now rules over a prison cell and the world is at peace. Then the credits roll. While I would have liked to see Mega Man return home to his family or show Mega Man walking home with Rush with Dr. Light and Roll reading the newspaper, while the story may be simple with a predictable plot twist in the middle, it has consistency in the regard that keeps things simple where it needs to be. Mega Man 5's story is probably my favorite in the classic series, but 6 gets the job done in giving Mega Man an excuse to defeat 8 Robot Masters and go after the main villain, and with it giving fans the ending we all wanted since Mega Man 1, it could have just ended here and moved on to Mega Man X and I would have been perfectly satisfied.
But of course that's not going to happen thanks to this.
But you gotta admit, that was a lot of fun.
You know what, Megadude TV? I agree with you 101%. Not only is this the best classic Mega Man game, this is probably the best Mega Man game, period.
Yeah, when I went into this game, I thought I would still maintain that it's my second favorite Mega Man game behind X2, but I now truly appreciate Mega Man 6 for all it's worth. I like it better than X2, and it's pretty close to the likes of Super Mario Bros. 3 in terms of always giving me a fresh challenge and engaging obstacle course design every single level. And if that wasn't enough, it succeeds in graphical and music presentation. The visual style is by far the best I've seen on the NES, from the metallic looking foregrounds giving off the illusion of reflection to the stellar designs of the backgrounds that just gives these levels even more life than ever before, especially for stages like Plant Man and Mr. X Stage 1. And one thing I just noticed on this playthrough is that if you revisit stages for the beat letters, the colors of the foregrounds change as well as some of the backgrounds, like how Tomahawk Man stage starts off at night instead of day, how Yamato Man stage has a sunset sky instead of a bright blue one, and how Nightman stage goes from sunset to cloudy. It doesn't change the game much, but it just makes it feel like some time has passed since I played through all the Robot Master stages, and given how these stages take place supposedly around the world, it seems like this factors in time zones where, because it's around midnight at Mr. X's stage, the sun may be setting over in Japan, or 6 AM in America since the sunrise shows itself halfway through the stage. The developers had to program this into the game, and I admire this idea despite it likely being overlooked by many players, myself included for the first few playthroughs. And the music is quite a joy to listen to because it's a Mega Man game. 6 games in, and the series has never failed to deliver a stellar soundtrack. Blizzard Man's theme has a really good melody to it, despite its slower tempo, but for this winter theme level, it just works and it's quite catchy if you ask me. Flame Man's theme has a unique intro with a catchy melody that is a lot more compositionally complex, and sounds like it would be a lot of fun for gaming musicians to cover. It just sounds like it's making the most out of all available sound channels on the NES. And Plant Man stage has a really quick tempo and catchy melody that just makes this a really fun listen, probably one of my favorite tracks in the entire game. That and Windman stage, because Windman not only has a fun melody with not one bad measure in the entire piece, but it gives off such an optimistic vibe appropriate for a level high in the sky. It's just so awesome. And I especially love how Wily has his own final boss theme. The melody feels like a chiptune orchestra playing for a cinematic battle to the death. It's really that good. The only thing remotely negative I have to say about the soundtrack is that not all of it works really well with the context of the stages, like Mr. X and Wily Fortress's themes for example. They sound a bit too optimistic and upbeat for otherwise treacherous stages, and I've criticized other Fortress stages before, and I'll do it again for these tracks. They should have had a more ominous or at least triumphant piece similar to Wily Castle 1 from Mega Man 2. I know that track is one of the most overplayed pieces in gaming history, but there's a very good reason for that. But really, that's just a minor complaint because all the tracks in the game don't really fall far behind in terms of overall individual quality. This is by far my favorite classic Mega Man soundtrack. It's not only varied in giving off different vibes in relation to the stages they're placed in, but also for how the composer gets what Mega Man is about. It's a game with shooting robots in a futuristic setting, but no two stages are alike in terms of sound, and I'm glad they get all aspects of Mega Man. This soundtrack is so good, I dare say it's a chiptune equivalent to some of the Mega Man X games. I'm not even exaggerating.
There's just so little I have to complain about. this game would get my recommendation that I don't often give to video games. Mega Man 6 is overall a masterful game.
Gotta admit, pretty good NES game. Not gonna lie.
I dare say this and Super Mario Bros. 3 are the reason to own an NES. Well, unless you just want to get the digital versions of those games, then that's fine too.
Despite this game selling the worst in the classic series so far, it's amazing how much of a life it has beyond being a 3rd gen game late in the 4th generation. With many people playing the various classic Mega Man collections, more and more people will discover this game and see it for what it is now. Sure, there are games like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, Mega Man X, and Super Metroid that were very successful and also among some of the best games ever made, but Mega Man 6 is the ultimate tale of an underdog game that gained the recognition it deserved a decade later due to its timeless quality, and in my honest opinion, not many games in that time even compare. Capcom developed this game with a lot of passion put into it, and by then, they knew the hardware so well they could make the most out of everything the NES had to offer, and maybe that's why they didn't move on to the SNES, because classic Mega Man's cultural significance was heavily associated with Nintendo's 8-bit console. And judging by how they continue to make games for the NES past 1991, it was probably inexpensive to produce these 8-bit games on a yearly basis, but with this being the last of the NES games, I'd say it's a perfect end to the NES era.
That was long.
Hey, I had a lot to say.
Hey, I'm not complaining, alright? But listen, I gotta go, okay? Because I gotta go do something important. But before I go, I just want to say something to the morons who are pretty much all of your audience, right? Because I don't know how anybody can watch this, right? Listen, in the description below, there's going to be a link to my channel. You better go there and better subscribe. Because if you guys can watch this absolute garbage trash, right? This garbage, but you cannot take 1 second, right, to go to my objectively better channel and start subscribing, I will come over there and I will show you the wrath of Mega Dupe TV. You have no idea. I will haunt your dreams. Okay? I am not playing.
Get out. I have a somewhat pretentious end of retrospective monologue to do. But thank you so much for joining me today.
This retrospective took a long time to make. I have probably around 200 pages of scripting total, and I don't regret a second of it. Some may see these games as just simple NES games that are not worth the time I put into them, but ever since I played these games when I was 16, I knew these were the games I wanted to cover when I finally had the resources to do so. And when I finally did, it was a long journey, and it sure wasn't doing any favors for my social life, but I'd say the time spent on these was worth it. I wouldn't spend my summer any other way since I said what I wanted to say for the longest time about each and every classic Mega Man entry on the NES. Now I really know how I feel about each game, and it made me realize my preferences have changed over the years. It also made me realize that classic Mega Man is my favorite video game series of all time, because despite being familiar every time, familiarity isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as there's a new journey alongside it. Even though some would like me to cover Mega Man 7 through 10 and Base and even Powered Up, continue on with the X games, and even give some light to the criminally overlooked Game Boy games, I'll save some of those games for next year, as 6 Mega Man games is plenty for one review show season. I do want to thank each and every one of you for the massive support I've gotten on these videos especially, and I do hope I convince some people to give these games a try, whether they be newcomers to the series, or people who've played 1 or 2 of these games but didn't understand the appeal of them initially.
But for now, this retrospective has finally come to a close. Thank you all so much for watching this entire retrospective, and as always, remember to stay awesome.